The abandoned stage station had been empty for 12 years, so Jonah Vale knew the whisper under its floorboards did not belong there. "Please, don't let the man with the silver spur hear me." Then the spur chimed again on the other side of the door. Jonah lowered his lantern. A narrow face stared up through a gap between two rotten planks. The girl could not have been more than 11. Mud streaked her cheeks. One braid had come loose. Both hands were wrapped around a brass survey compass as though it were the last solid thing in the world. Jonah had spent 6 years avoiding other people's trouble. Trouble had just looked him in the eye. He eased one floorboard back into place and crossed the room before the latch lifted. 3 riders entered with the storm behind them. Their leader was a long-faced man named Rafe Danner. One of his boots carried a polished silver spur that chimed every time he shifted his weight. Jonah knew the type. Men like Rafe did not ask questions because they already believed fear was an answer. Rafe studied the wet footprints on the floor. "You alone?" Jonah set the lantern on a cracked counter. "Was, until you came in." The other 2 men spread through the station, kicking open cupboards and stabbing rifle barrels beneath broken furniture. Under Jonah's boots, the girl did not move. Rafe's spur chimed once. Then again. He stopped directly above the loose plank. Jonah tipped a rusted coffee pot from the counter with his elbow. All 3 riders turned. Jonah drew before the pot stopped rolling. Not fast enough to start a war, fast enough to make the price clear. "You search my shelter," he said. "You do it with your hands where I can see them." Rafe smiled, but the smile never reached his eyes. "We're looking for a thief's daughter." "What did she steal?" "A lie." Jonah glanced at the rifles, the silver spur, and the 3 fresh horses outside. Then he looked back at Rafe. Must be a valuable lie. For one breath nobody moved. Thunder broke over the mountain. Rafe finally stepped away from the floorboard. "The road east is washed out," he said. "If you see the girl, keep her here." He tapped the silver spur against the threshold. "We'll come back." Jonah waited until the darkness swallowed them. Then he lifted the plank. The girl was trembling so hard the compass clicked against her teeth. "My name is Lucía Ortega," she said. "They took my father." Jonah offered his hand. She did not take it. That told him more than the words did. He backed away and let her climb out by herself. Lucía wore a faded burgundy dress, a patched gray shawl, and boots too thin for the cold. Around her neck hung a leather cord tied to the brass compass. "My father said I had to reach San Rosario," she whispered. "He said there was one person there who still printed the truth." Jonah knew the town. He also knew the man who owned most of the land around it. Everett Rusk had arrived in the territory with cattle, lawyers, and enough money to make theft look official. When drought came, he bought desperate ranches for pennies. When people refused to sell, their boundary stakes moved in the night. Irrigation ditches collapsed. Tax notices appeared on land that had never owed $1. Anyone who challenged him discovered how quickly paper could become a weapon. Jonah had once worn a deputy's badge in San Rosario. He had left it behind with everything else. Lucía watched his face change. "You know him. I know what men like him build." "What?" "Rooms where everyone is afraid to speak first." Outside, hoofbeats returned sooner than they should have. Jonah killed the lantern. There was no time for the road. He led Lucía through the station's rear storeroom, broke open a warped trapdoor, and lowered her into the old stage drain beneath the building. Cold water rushed around their boots as they crawled through black timber and mud. Above them, the front door exploded inward. Rafe's voice carried through the floor. "Vale." Jonah froze. Lucía looked at him. Rafe had not asked who he was. He already knew. Jonah pushed her forward. They emerged behind a wall of mesquite 50 yards downslope. His horse waited under the trees, reins dragging. He put Lucía in the saddle and climbed behind her. A rifle cracked from the station. The bullet tore through the edge of Jonah's coat. They rode into the storm. By dawn, the rain had weakened to a cold mist. Jonah found shelter in a shepherd's stone hut above the river. He built a small fire and handed Lucía the driest blanket he had. Only then did she open the brass compass. The needle was missing. Under the glass, where a mapmaker's name should have been, her father had scratched 4 words. "Eastmark, Gate 7, 3 feet. Jonah read them twice. Lucía said, "My father surveyed the valley for Mr. Rusk." "Why would Rusk hunt him?" "'Cause he found the old plats." Jonah looked up. Lucía explained that the first land maps of the valley showed something the new records did not. Rusk had moved property lines, renamed public water channels, and placed the main headgate on private land that he claimed belonged to him. It was not just land theft. He controlled the water. A family could own a field and still starve if Rusk closed the gate. Her father, Tomas Ortega, had copied the original plats and matched them against tax ledgers, ditch records, and telegraph receipts. He had proof that dozens of ranches had been taken through forged surveys. Before Rusk's men came, Tomas removed the compass needle, scratched the message beneath the glass, and told Lucía to find Nora Finch, the printer in San Rosario. Then he hid Lucía in the stage station and rode the other direction. He said they would follow him, Lucía whispered. Jonah stared into the fire. He was buying you time. Is he dead? Jonah could have offered the soft lie. Instead, he said, I don't know. Lucía nodded as though truth, even painful truth, was something she could stand on. That made leaving harder. Jonah had planned to put her on a southbound freight wagon and disappear before noon. He had lived by one rule since surrendering his badge: never stay long enough to be needed. But Rafe knew his name, and Tomas Ortega's message pointed toward a place Jonah remembered. Gate 7 was part of an old irrigation headworks built across Arroyo Cobre. Jonah had guarded payroll crews there 14 years earlier, before Everett Rusk owned half the valley. He also remembered signing an escort log for a locked survey chest, a chest Rusk's lawyer had insisted contained harmless county copies. 3 families were evicted the next month. Jonah had asked questions too late. His younger partner asked louder questions. They buried him outside town. Jonah removed his badge the following morning and never returned. Lucía's father had hidden the truth inside the same system Jonah had once helped protect. Some roads did not let a man ride past them twice. By midday they were headed for San Rosario. The town saw them before they reached the first building. A boy carrying coal stopped in the street. A shopkeeper pulled his wife inside. Doors closed one after another until the whole place seemed to hold its breath. On the wall beside the livery hung a fresh notice: wanted for chilled abduction. Below it was a rough drawing of Jonah's face. Lucía stared at the paper. They made you the criminal. Jonah tore the notice down. No, he said. They made a story. Stories only become law when everyone agrees to repeat them. At the far end of the street stood the office of the San Rosario Gazette. Its windows were dark. The press inside had been smashed. A woman stepped from the alley with ink on her sleeves and a small pistol in her hand. Nora Finch was in her 30s, sharp-eyed and furious in the quiet way of someone who had already spent all her fear. You brought half the valley behind you, she told Jonah. I noticed. She looked at Lucía. Tomas? Lucía shook her head. Nora's expression tightened, but she did not waste the child's time with pity. She took them through the back of the print shop and pulled a stack of hidden type trays from beneath the floor. Tomas had sent her copies of tax entries for months, not enough to break Rusk. Enough to show a pattern. What he found at Gate 7 is different, Nora said. The original plats carry seals. The ditch company records carry signatures. Put them together and Rusk's ownership disappears. Jonah heard Boots' side, not Silver. He knew these. Sheriff Amos Pike entered alone. Once, Amos had stood beside Jonah under gunfire and laughed because they were both too scared to do anything else. Now his beard was gray, his shoulders were bent, and he would not meet Jonah's eyes. Everett wants the girl, Amos said. Nora raised her pistol. Amos did not look at her. Put it down. There are 12 men in the street. Jonah watched his old friend's hands. They were shaking. Are you here as sheriff? Jonah asked, or as Rusk's messenger? Amos swallowed. Both. That was answer enough. He arrested Jonah in front of the town. Lucía fought when a deputy tried to separate them. Jonah told her to stop, not because he trusted Amos, because Rafe Danner was watching from across the street. The silver spur caught the light. Jonah was locked in the sheriff's rear cell. Lucía was placed in the records room under guard. Nora vanished before Rusk's men entered the building. Everett Rusk arrived near sunset. He wore a black wool coat untouched by mud and carried no visible weapon. Men like him preferred other people to look dangerous. He stopped outside Jonah's cell. You always did mistake guilt for principle, Rusk said. Jonah gripped the bars. And you always mistook a signed paper for the truth. Rusk smiled. A signed paper is whatever the frightened man holding the pen needs it to be. He turned toward the records room. Lucía backed away when he entered. Rusk noticed the leather cord around her neck. Your father made you carry something. She covered the compass with both hands. Rusk held out his palm. Give it to me and I will tell you where he is. Lucía's face changed. For one terrible second, she became only a child who wanted her father back. Then she remembered what he had taught her. If you knew where he was, she said, you wouldn't need this. Rusk's smile vanished. Rafe tore the compass from her neck. Jonah slammed into the bars hard enough to split his knuckles. Amos stood in the doorway and did nothing. Rusk opened the compass. He read the scratched words. Then he looked at Amos. Bring the girl. Burn the shop. Open the flood release before midnight. Jonah understood at once. The storm had filled the upper reservoir. If Rusk opened the release, the first wall of water would tear through Gate 7, rip out the old stonework, and carry every hidden record down the arroyo. Rusk was not only taking Lucía, he was erasing the valley's memory. Jonah sat on the cell floor and listened to them leave. This was the moment he had spent 6 years avoiding. Not a gunfight, not a grave. A locked door and the knowledge that fear had won while he watched. Amos remained by the desk. Jonah spoke without looking at him. How long? Amos said nothing. How long have you been feeding him names? The old sheriff's breathing grew uneven. Since your partner died. Jonah looked up. Amos confessed in pieces. Rusk had threatened his wife first, then his son. After they moved east, Rusk kept the letters Amos had signed, the false warrants he had served, and the prisoners he had delivered. The danger changed. The obedience did not. I told myself I was keeping the town alive, Amos whispered. Jonah stood. No. You were teaching it to kneel. The words hit harder because Jonah knew they applied to him too. Amos opened the cell. On his desk lay Jonah's old white-handled revolver. Amos had kept it for 14 years. Beside it lay a ledger Rusk's men had dropped while searching the office. Jonah opened the ledger. There was his own signature, his escort authorization, his badge number, proof that the forged survey chest had passed through his hands. Lucía's father had not only uncovered Rusk's crime, he had uncovered Jonah's place in it. Jonah closed the book. Then I finish what my badge helped start. Amos strapped on his gun. Nora stepped from the records closet. She had never left. She carried a bundle of metal type, a bottle of lamp oil, and the look of a woman with a plan that could either save a town or burn one. Within 10 minutes, the damaged press was turning by hand. Nora printed one sentence across every scrap of paper she had. Rusk is flooding Gate 7 to destroy your land wreckers. A stable boy rode the notices to every ranch along the ditch road. Jonah and Amos rode for Arroyo Cobre. The storm returned after dark. Gate 7 stood between two black cliffs, a timber and stone headworks above a narrow channel. Water thundered behind the upper barrier. Lanterns moved along the catwalk. Rusk's men had tied Lucía beside the gauge house. Rafe Danner was forcing the release wheel with an iron bar. Every turn lifted the gate another inch. Jonah dismounted below the ridge. Amos counted 6 rifles. Jonah counted the water. They had minutes. Nora's notices had not promised help. Fear had ruled the valley too long for promises. Still in the darkness behind them, another horse arrived, then 3 more, then a wagon. Families who had lost fields, orchards, and cattle gathered along the ridge carrying hunting rifles, ditch shovels, and lanterns. They did not come because they believed Jonah could save them. They came because for the first time they understood exactly what Rusk was destroying. Amos stepped into the open. As sheriff of San Rosario, he ordered the men at Gate 7 to lower their weapons. Rusk laughed. Then Amos read names from the ledger. Men Rusk had paid. Families he had cheated. Witnesses he had buried under false charges. With every name, another person on the ridge raised a lantern, the dark filled with faces. Rusk's power had always depended on each frightened person believing he was frightened alone. That lie broke first. Rafe fired. The catwalk erupted into motion. Jonah crossed the lower channel under the gunfire, climbed the wet support braces, and reached Lucía as Rafe dragged her toward the release wheel. The silver spur chimed against the iron grate. Lucía heard it. This time, she did not hide. She dropped flat, seized the loose counterweight chain Tomas had once shown her, and pulled it through the emergency ratchet. The release wheel stopped. Rafe kicked at her. His silver spur caught between 2 chain links. He fell backward, hanging from the catwalk rail by one arm. Jonah took the rifle from him and hauled Lucía clear. Rafe stared down at the flood channel. "Help me." Jonah looked at the man who had hunted a child through a storm. Then he reached down and pulled him up. Living men can testify. He bound Rafe to the railing with the same chain. Rusk ran for the gauge house. The message in the compass had not meant 3 feet east of the gate. It meant 3 feet beneath the east survey mark. Lucía found the carved mark in the stone foundation. Jonah drove a pry bar into the mortar. Behind the block was a narrow iron cylinder sealed with pitch. Inside were the original plats, the ditch company charter, tax copies, and a list of every false claim Rusk had filed. There was also a letter from Tomas Ortega. Lucía opened it with shaking hands. Her father wrote that if she was reading those words, he had failed to return. He told her not to confuse surviving with surrendering. He told her the truth was not brave by itself. People had to carry it. Lucía pressed the letter to her chest. Rusk appeared behind them with Jonah's old escort ledger in one hand and a pistol in the other. "Give me the cylinder." Jonah stepped between him and Lucía. Rusk lifted the pistol. "You think these people came for justice? They came because they smell a winner." "No," Jonah said. "They came because you finally gave them one place to stand." Rusk fired. The shot struck the stone beside Jonah's head. Jonah crossed the space before Rusk could fire again. They crashed through the gauge house door and onto the rain-slicked catwalk. Rusk fought with the desperation of a man who had never imagined losing control. Jonah fought with 14 years of shame behind every strike. Rusk reached the open release lever. If he pulled it, the emergency ratchet would shear. Lucía saw what he was doing. She grabbed the brass compass from the floor, ran to the mechanism, and drove its heavy case beneath the lever's locking tooth. The brass bent. The lever held. Rusk stared at her. The child he had chased across the territory was standing between him and the only escape he understood. "My father was afraid of you," Lucía said. "He told the truth anyway. That hesitation cost him." Jonah knocked the pistol away. Amos crossed the catwalk and placed Rusk under arrest in front of the people he had taught to fear him. No one cheered. The water still roared. Tomas was still missing. Too much had been taken for celebration. But one by one, the family stepped forward to sign their names as witnesses. By morning, Nora had printed copies of the plats, the ledger, and Tomas's letter. Riders carried them to the territorial land office, the circuit judge, and 3 newspapers beyond Rusk's reach. The evidence could no longer be burned in one room or drowned beneath one gate. Weeks later, federal examiners reopened the claims. Some families recovered land. Others received water access and restitution. Not every wrong was repaired. But Rusk's private ditch company was dissolved, the headgate returned to public control, and the sheriff's office released the prisoners held under his false warrants. Amos resigned. Before he did, he testified to every order he had obeyed and every name he had hidden. Rafe Danner testified too. The silver spur was entered as evidence. They found Tomas Ortega 2 months later in a work camp across the border, alive but badly injured. Rusk's men had kept him there under another name. When Lucía saw her father step down from the wagon, she did not run at first. She stood perfectly still, as though one movement might break the moment. Then Tomas opened his arms. Jonah turned away to give them privacy. Lucía caught his coat before he could leave. "Where are you going?" He looked toward the road. For years, the road had meant freedom because it asked nothing of him. Now it looked empty. The old stage station was repaired before winter, not as a school, not as a sheriff's post. It became a public way station called the Lantern House, where travelers could find water, a meal, and a place to sleep without being asked who owned the road behind them. Tomas kept survey maps in the front room. Nora kept extra newspapers by the stove. Jonah kept a lantern burning above the door. Lucía kept the bent brass compass on a shelf beside the loose floorboard that had once hidden her. Years later, she became a surveyor herself. Her maps were known for one unusual detail. Every public ditch, footpath, and water crossing was drawn larger than required, so no powerful man could pretend he had not seen them. People told the story of Gate 7 as a battle. They remembered the flood, the rifles, and the fall of Everett Rusk. Lucía told it differently. She said her life changed because in a storm loud enough to drown out anything, one man heard the quietest voice in the room and answered.